Following schedule, the plane started the last leg of the routine round trip at 1:25 p.m. There were 95 people on board the aircraft, 89 passengers, 2 pilots, 3 flight attendants, and an FAA traffic controller who stayed in the observer seat in the cockpit. After a normal takeoff and ascent, the plane got to the usual cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. And then, at about 1:48 p.m., 26 miles away from Kahului, Maui, the unexpected happened. Those who were in the cockpit heard a loud whooshing sound and a crack, following by the deafening sound of wind seconds later. Apparently, a small part of the roof on the left side tore loose, which led to the explosive decompression of the plane. But the worst thing was that the decompression caused a huge section of the airplane's roof to tear off completely. The length of the missing part was 18.5 feet long, and that was the aircraft skin that covered the plane from the cockpit back to the forewing area. At first, the pilots didn't realize what had happened. The first officer, who was in control of the aircraft at that moment, felt her head jerk backwards, and she noticed debris and gray pieces of insulation flying chaotically around the cockpit. When the captain turned his head, he saw that the cockpit door had disappeared, and instead of the first-class ceiling, he was staring at the clear blue sky. The plane started to roll from side to side, and it was becoming increasingly harder to control. Everybody who was in the cockpit immediately put on their oxygen masks, and the captain took over the aircraft. He brought the speed brakes into action and began an urgent descent toward the nearest airport, which was on Maui Island. Luckily, all the passengers were in their seats at the moment when the accident happened, and since the seatbelt sign was still on, everyone had their seatbelts fastened. However, all 3 flight attendants were standing along the aircraft aisle. The one who was closest to the front of the plane was swept out through the hole in the roof. The other 2 were thrown to the floor by a forceful jerk, but while one of them hit her head really hard and lost consciousness, the other started to crawl along the aisle in an attempt to help passengers and calm them down. At the same time, the pilots were trying to contact air traffic control and signal an emergency. To make matters worse, they couldn't hear each other and had to use gestures to communicate. They also didn't know whether their radio worked and whether they had managed to deliver their message. It turned out that the controller hadn't been receiving the crew's messages until the aircraft descended to an altitude of 14,000 feet. Only then the signal got through, and Maui Tower started urgent preparations for an emergency landing. On top of that, the controller didn't catch that passengers and crew members would need medical help. After all, the crew only announced that they had experienced a rapid decompression, which didn't reveal the entire horror of the situation. In the meantime, the plane had already dropped to a height of 10,000 feet above sea level. The captain removed his oxygen mask and withdrew the speed brakes. The plane was moving toward runway 2 of Kahului Airport. Following the captain's command, the first officer lowered the landing gear, but the indicator light didn't come on. As the plane was approaching the runway, the left engine failed and the aircraft started rocking and shaking. The captain made an attempt to restart the engine but didn't succeed. And still, at 1:58 p.m., just 10 minutes after the emergency and 35 minutes after the takeoff, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 managed to touch down on the runway of Kahului Airport. Landing a plane with such a huge loss of integrity was an unprecedented feat.